us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
John, Donald Trump got the response from the Iranian side, and he was waited because they supposed to receive it before, but after 4 days, as Donald Trump himself pointed out, we waited 4 days for a document from Iran that would take less than 10 minutes to prepare. And
Yes.
basically, it's talking about because Iran didn't change that much in this new response to the American proposal. The head of Iranian parliament is talking about basically the main points on the part of Iranians are the 14-point plan that they have, handed to American side before this. We had 10-point plan, if you remember, then 14-point plan, which was the 10-point plan together with some preconditions on the part of Iranians. And on the other hand, yesterday, the head of Iranian parliament tweeted that we are prepared. If it is diplomacy, we're prepared for that. If it's war, we are more than prepared for that. And we have surprises for you. Donald Trump is going to be in China on Wednesday. And how do you see the Iranian response and the way that Donald Trump expected the Iranian response and the way it went so far?
Big question. Let's take the pieces piece by piece. It's very valuable that you should indicate what Mr. Ghalibaf has said, because it's essential that we do understand the limitations of what Trump's able to say about what he understands the Iranian side is saying. It's interesting that, and I can recommend that our audience go to rollcall.com and look at the full transcript or watch it. It's easier to cope with Trump when you read it, of the May 11 press conference, which ironically was given at a mental health care event. If ever there was a case from Trump's texts of someone badly in need of mental health care, it's him. But let's just go through it. In the first place, you made a very important point, Nima. The way he described the Iranian paper, and then said he couldn't be bothered to read all the way through it, indicates that he can't understand what he's shown, what he's reading. He doesn't actually read the originals. Others bring him summaries, quotes, excerpts, but he can't, his brain doesn't work on the detail. So 14 points, he maybe understands in general 2 or 3 ideas. First point, this is a serious problem from the Iranian side or for the Chinese side, for the Russian side. Bear in mind, President Putin will follow to China quite shortly. It's been very clear, and Yuri Ushakov indicated that the Russian visit to China is around the corner. So how does one understand to negotiate with Trump when he can't understand the main points? First. Second, as I understand it, the Iranian side has, as it were, grouped its points into 3 stages. The first stage is confidence building and stabilizing the, let's call it the platform of the battlefield. So there is no fighting, and each side is secure in understanding that there will be no resumption of fighting. And the Chinese side clearly has emphasized, as Mr. Wang Yi emphasized, foreign minister, but more importantly, Politburo member, with Abbas Araghchi last week, not only no resumption of fighting, but a stable base for negotiations. So the Chinese side is endorsing the staging, as the Iranian side seems to have put it. First, a durable ceasefire and trust in the Americans not to break the ceasefire. Durable covering the Israelis as well. But we we basically already know the Americans broke the ceasefire with their provocative naval maneuvers in the Strait of Hormuz, and the Israelis have, if anything, escalated in Lebanon. So there's repeated violations of ceasefire. So stage one, from an Iranian point of view, or from anyone else's point of view, is confidence building and stable adherence to terms. Trump doesn't get that. And in fact, he doesn't mention it. What he does mention over and over, and we've often referred to this as a cognitive disability on the president's part, and it's getting worse. You can see from the text in rollcall.com, and I've got it in front of me. That's why I'm looking down at the paper. You can see that he can't understand more than one or two concepts of this negotiation. And so he focuses, actually in contradiction to the Iranian three stages. Iranian three stages, and correct me if I'm wrong: one, stable base, stable ceasefire, confidence building that one side isn't violating, and the two sides who are violators are the US and Israel. One. Two, a Hormuz regime that comprises not only the Straits regime for the future, a toll that covers reparations, but also a dismantling of US and worldwide sanctions on Iran, of which the Hormuz blockade is a good example. Third stage is nuclear issues. That's on the one hand an Iranian undertaking not to develop a nuclear weapon. On the next, it's the issue of what's to be done with the stock of enriched nuclear material. And then associated with that is the issue of Iranian missile defenses capabilities, the Israeli demand to disarm Iran entirely. Well, let's just say the Israeli war aim here is genocidal destruction of the Iranian state, disarmament of every kind, and so forth and so on. But looking at exactly what Trump had to say, he's asked what sort of plan he has in dealing with the Iranian proposal. And he repetitively goes to what he calls a very simple plan. Now, he's actually describing what's inside his head, which is very simple, and it's repeated. I don't know why, he says, you don't say it like it is. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Now, he repeats that approximately 3 times in about 5 minutes. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. He's, in other words, going to the third stage where Iran's proposals don't go yet. He doesn't and won't address the so-called preconditions, stage 1, stage 2. He can't accept as a negotiating position that the US has to reassure its adversary. No. Instead, his notion of negotiation is destroy the other side, which he repeats by saying that he's destroyed the Navy, he's destroyed the Air Force. They have no anti-aircraft, he says. And I'm flipping my page. Then he goes to something that's almost indicative of his failure to understand the nuclear enrichment issue. Iran told me very strongly, I'm quoting, because they intend to give us the nuclear dust, as I call it. What he means by nuclear dust is the stock of enriched nuclear material. But he calls it dust. It's easier than talking about other terms because it's a term, he means dust, but the nuclear dust, which is what we hit, then he repeats this story that in fact, the bombing raid of last June, the uncontested bombing raid on Natanz, Isfahan, and the third site, he claims We've destroyed it entirely. So
Yeah,
there's
Fordo. You mean Fordo?
Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. He claims, on the one hand, the United States must take out the dust and that Iran has agreed. That's false. Iran has, in fact, said, we will retain the materials. President Putin spoke of this in some detail, interestingly, on Saturday night. I can come back to that in a minute. There's no question that Iran refuses to hand over enriched nuclear materials, either current stocks or future stocks that might be developed out of Bushehr and other nuclear facilities. Trump both says we destroyed it and says we want to take it. In other words, it exists. He can't mentally grip the contradictions between the two. So then he says, repeating it, they guarantee, meaning Iran, no nuclear weapons for a very long period of time and a couple of other minor things, but they just can't get there. That's about his last word on the third stage, but it indicates he's nowhere near addressing the first two stages: ceasefire, stable undertakings, which also include no resumption of the US bases in the area, no reinforcements, and so forth and so on. He can't grip and can't address the three stages. Therefore, he hasn't read, because he says he threw it away. He stopped reading the plan. Now, what does one have when one looks at such a negotiator? What does the Iranian side think when they look at his two delegated negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner, from Iranian point of view, from the record they've made in Gaza, the record they've made everywhere? They are liars. They are deception operators. They are sabotage agents. They are smoke screeners. They cannot be trusted to negotiate in good faith, fundamentally. However, Iran says, as you said, Ghalibaf says, if they want to negotiate, we're ready. Ghalibaf is not, if I'm not mistaken, explicitly criticizing Witkoff and Kushner's performance to date. The same thing with China, the same thing with President Putin's press conference last Saturday night. So what do we have then? A US president who can't mentally deal with a plan of any kind, in this case Iranian, but with Chinese and Russian additions. He can't negotiate through two negotiators who are considered absolutely untrustworthy. You can't negotiate with them. That leaves Vance, and all of the publicity that's come from Axios about what Vance achieved or didn't achieve, what pieces of paper he nearly signed, what he did. Axios is simply a totally inaccurate Israeli mouthpiece in Washington. And the reporter who reflects that is Israeli, has served in the Israeli military, and isn't to be believed. Not only that, the record shows that whatever he reports is exclusive. And Trump is talking to him relatively regularly now, giving him exclusives. He's a deception operator. That's all. So it's near impossible to see how one would negotiate with such a combination. Vance is sidelined. Witkoff and Kushner are untrustworthy. And Trump is mentally incapable. Okay, now let's look. If you don't mind, I'll just extend it a bit to an important contribution Putin made, and then we'll come back to what you have to say about China, the China visit. On Saturday night, it's been much misunderstood in the Western press, what President Putin said. He was speaking, I need to point out to our audience and remind, that it was the end of the Victory Day parade. and he was speaking to a group of Russian reporters. Okay, so I'll sum up what he said as a policy of 3 or 4 no's. There's to be no Russian criticism of Trump. There's to be no Russian deterrence of US action on the Ukraine battlefield or throughout Europe. No Russian deterrence for the remilitarization of Germany, which has its counterpart with China and the remilitarization of Japan. So no criticism of Trump, no deterrence of US action, no escalation control. That's what Russia is, as it were, having difficulty gripping right now. We can go into the details on the battlefield, at sea, and in relation to the drone war, as the Ukrainians are increasingly using their range. And finally, no hurry. This is important. Let me explain. Russia is in the US equivalent of a midterm election campaign. The national parliamentary elections take place in the 3rd week of September, pardon me, September 25, which is a very short distance away. What we have then is a significant locking in of domestic political campaign calculation. In such a time, what does a candidate trying to mobilize against increasing public disapproval of president's performance, prime minister's performance, governor's performance, parliamentary performance, and so on, but no disapproval of the army's performance? That's constant and high. The correlation between approval of Putin and approval of the Russian army has been broken now. It's very important to understand how Russians begin to feel about this. In this context, Putin is not in a hurry to do anything surprising. He needs to be reassuring. He needs to be reassuring to Trump. He needs to be reassuring to the Chinese. He needs to be reassuring to Iran, to North Korea, to Cuba. He wants, in fact, a relatively stable platform as he goes into the election, because he's got to combat rising disapproval. So no criticism of Trump is part of the no hurry. No deterrence for the United States is really a statement of we're not going to escalate. Those threats to use the Oreshnik against the center of Kiev, they were empty to start with. The Europeans treated them as empty. There was no drone attack on the parade on Saturday. There was no Russian retaliation. If you look carefully at the battlefield, you see slow preparation and a slowdown of advance westward. So no escalation control in any area. No escorts, military escorts at sea. Why? Because in fact, when you look at it carefully, the Russian side sees long negotiation on the Iran war, high oil price between 95 and 110, long negotiation, get us into the election month at that level of price, with a fleet that currently, some of these so-called alternative fleet tankers are idle. Russia doesn't need to arm, escort all the tankers that are going out that are threatened by the Europeans or the Americans, or threatened by Ukrainian drone attacks. Doesn't need to, because some are idle. It can sacrifice tankers because it's got plenty. At the moment, the damage Ukrainian drones have done to Russian export infrastructure has been more than offset by, let's call it, the Iran war-induced price. So we are exporting less volume, but earning more revenue. And that combination is part of Putin's no hurry till we get to the election. That's, as I understand it, the kind of line he tried to run on Saturday night, with one important point I need to reinforce. I published it yesterday. You can look at it. Readers can look at it in Dances with Bez. It's what President Putin said about the murder of Ali Larijani. This must be understood in Tehran to be deeply offensive. Why? When President Putin telephoned President Trump a few days ago, he made the point, I believe it's April 29, but I've forgotten the dates in my head. It was 3 days after the so-called assassination attempt in the Hilton Hotel ballroom. President Trump, according to the readout from Yuri Ushakov, expressed his great sympathy for President Trump, his family, and his friends and officials, that the assassination attempt was foiled. He expressed sympathy for what had happened and encouragement to the president, April 29. And yet Saturday night, when speaking of the Russian contribution to the negotiations on nuclear issues, Putin referred to Ali Larijani, whom he's met 4 times, and negotiated on the nuclear issue with Larijani, who was secretary or chief executive of the Supreme National Security Council in Iran. He spoke of him unfortunately passing away. The Russian is ushol iz zhizny, depart from life, passing away. Now, you never and can't use that Russian expression to describe bombing, assassination, or murder. That's what happened to Larijani. Not only that, Putin knows perfectly well that Netanyahu claimed credit for it and that Trump immediately endorsed it. Why express sympathy for Trump at an attempted assassination and use euphemisms that are offensively euphemistic about murder and assassination for Larijani? That's indicative of the way in which President Putin speaks publicly in such a way as to ingratiate, appease President Trump. That's the first no criticism of Trump. I guess I've said enough about.
Yeah. Well, John, the other point that Poon mentioned is about the enriched uranium. He said, like 2015, we can do something about that, and they may send, the enriched uranium to Russia instead of sending that to the United States. But I don't see that happening as well, because they said, Iranian part said that this enriched uranium, 400 kilogram of enriched uranium, is it's like Iranian soil. It's not going to leave Iran, and it's going to stay in Iran. We can find some sort of solution for that, but it's not going to go to Russia or the United States. But Putin repeated that. I don't know what is his understanding of Iranian position.
He repeated his understanding. What he said was, yes, in 2015, we reached a deal on the enriched uranium problem or issue. Everyone, said Putin, had agreed, including Israel. He mentioned Israel as having agreed then. So we're talking about the JCPOA Obama agreement. He said subsequently, without getting into the time frame, Larijani came to me. And in that context, he said what I've just said about Larijani. And said, no, Iran is intending to keep the enriched uranium. And Putin said, that's fine with me, but you understand the United States and Israel will not agree. And that's all he said on the issue. By making it clear it was still a subject to be negotiated, but the Iranian position, he said, implied better, was not going to be acceptable to the United States and Israel. Implication, some form of compromise has to be reached on that. And that takes us back to where Trump is. We want to take the, quotes, nuclear dust. So Putin is basically saying, we made an offer, we continue to have that offer on the table. That is to say, some form of holding the enriched nuclear materials in such a way as to neutralize its threat as Israel sees it and the United States sees it. The offer's on the table. Nobody's going to accept it, neither Iran nor the United States nor Israel. And that's the point at which he left the subject.
Yeah, John, here is what the spokesperson for Iran's Parliament's Foreign Policy and National Security Committee in Iran posted just moments ago before coming to this live. He said one of Iran's option in the event of another attack could be 90% enrichment. So this is the response to Donald Trump. And if it seems that they're seriously considering that in Iranian parliament, and if they decide about it, there is no way that the government or anybody can go against it, because it's going to be in the parliament. Then the Guardian Council in Iran, and it's going to be the government should, follow what they are asking for. And I think somehow you look at the escalation, we're heading to that moment. I think it's going to be 60% if they go to 90%, because they're talking about nuclear dust. What does that mean? I don't know. The guy is trying to deceive himself. I don't know how is that going to help him.
Well, we're not talking across purposes. We're simply you're explaining that the Iranian side says, if you attack, then we reserve the right to enrich to nuclear warhead status with the missile stocks we have. And if you threaten us, and behind this is something we've discussed before, it's a very serious matter. We're not talking lightly about it, that Israel has nuclear attack plans for Iran, probably concentrating on targets in the northern half of Iran, and thereby creating potential threats to the eastern countries, starting with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then India. This is a very serious issue that those countries need to be aware of and are aware of. But let me tackle your question in a slightly different way by going back to what Trump says he thinks he's doing. He was asked, the question was, is there still a leadership in Iran that you believe you can negotiate with? Trump quotes, I think so. Well, you have two. You have the moderates and you have the lunatics. And I think the moderates are more respected. The lunatics want to fight till the end. There will be it'll be a very quick fight. But I call them, you have, just like our country, we have lunatics too. I call them lunatics. I call them stupid people too. But in Iran, they have the moderates. They're dying to make a deal. And then you have the lunatics. And I guess they're a little bit afraid of the lunatics. But why not? The level of ferocity for protests, the people are watching it. They want to go out in the streets. You can hear there in a disordered mind. Let's not be in any misunderstanding here. That man, his mind is disordered. You can't negotiate with such a cognitively disabled individual, but you can hear what he's being briefed. We know he doesn't read. He's being briefed by the CIA and others that the Iranian people are ready to go back into the street to protest. We know that to be false. And we also believe that John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, is likely to have told Trump that attempt at regime change in January has failed. First. Second, you can hear the analysis of the intelligence services that there are two factions in Iran. You don't hear them saying, by decapitating the moderates, you've left what he calls the lunatics. You don't hear them telling Trump, and you don't hear him understanding that the Israeli policy of decapitation has in fact radicalized the leadership and preserved it on a different basis. No, that's beyond his ability to understand, because he thinks he's decapitated everybody and everything. So you have the capacity to understand, we'd like to talk to the moderates, but we can't deal with the lunatics, so we'll have to kill them. So we come back exactly as you said, Nima, to a standoff in which, if Trump is to continue along this line, this is not an individual who's looking for an exit. This is not an individual showing that he regards the negotiation with Iran as necessary to protect his political position in the midterm elections come November the 3rd. He's not showing. If we just look back at this disordered mind, you can at least say what there isn't. There's no reference here to the price of oil. There's no reference to the Strait of Hormuz. There's no reference to using force to achieve a domestic value that would help him and the Republicans retain a majority in Congress. So you'd have to conclude, is it possible? No, it's not possible for Trump to negotiate directly with Iran in the way we've expressed it. So then the question you raised at the beginning, Nima, and we're here on Tuesday, and tomorrow Trump arrives in the evening in Beijing. What can the meeting with China do to benefit the goals for the Strait of Hormuz, the ceasefire, the terms of peace that China says, according to the President Xi's 4 propositions, that China endorses? Can China either pressure or induce or persuade Trump on any form of negotiated outcome that isn't fighting? Can he do that? Can Xi do that with Trump? Is Trump even looking for that as he gets to Beijing? I think that was the question you began with, wasn't it, Nima?
Yeah. I think many people are somehow arguing, or they want to know, people want to know, what does Donald Trump want from China with this trip? Is he going to do some sort of business together with China? Is he going to ask something about Russia and Iran? And what would be the response from Chinese part? And it doesn't seem that China would, or anybody, I don't see Russia or Iran helping Donald Trump with his timeline. That's why Iran, as I've mentioned before, is not giving any sort of sign that they're giving something to Donald Trump before going to China. And that was the main point on the part of Iranians. You're not going to get anything from us to help you with this visit of China. And nobody seems to be interested to help Donald Trump. But how is that going to help him? How is that going to shape the atmosphere in China? How do you see that happening?
Well, that's a very difficult question for me to ask as a Russia correspondent first. So I've got to disclaim any special knowledge, any sources, or any Russian insight into the behavior of President Xi, who also has his factional conflicts over Taiwan, over the remilitarization of Japan, over domestic issues and so forth. We've talked a bit about that in the past. We also talked about the unwillingness of China to confirm that Trump's visit was on all of last week, from the Arakchi visit and the readout from Wang Yi after Arakchi's meeting, right through the week, through Friday, the Chinese side refused to confirm that the summit meeting was on. Instead, they seem to be creating preconditions relating to the Strait of Hormuz. I can just read you because they've been repeating it all the way through the week, and they repeated it May 12th. That's today in Beijing, the foreign ministry briefing, asked about what China's view will be as the visit begins. Guo Jiakun, who's the principal spokesman at the foreign ministry, says, on the Iran conflict, the pressing priority now is to prevent by all means a relapse in fighting. Now, the term relapse in fighting, they'd used all the way through last week. And they didn't make it, they appeared to make it a precondition to Trump's visit. Trump did resume fighting with a performative naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz, with the triggering of action by both sides in and around the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. The US escalated with sanctions against China. Both the most recent sanction was on Friday, where the State Department and the Treasury, the OFAC, the Office of OFAC, the sanctions agency, announced that it was sanctioning several Chinese companies for having supplied satellite information to the Iranians to improve its targeting. That followed sanctions against Chinese refinery companies for accepting Russian and Iranian oil, principally Iranian oil, in the so-called independent refinery teapot trade. So what happened during the week when China seemed to be conditioning the visit on Trump's avoiding a relapse of fighting and avoidance of escalation into higher sanctions, the US simply ignored China and provoked them. This is typical, one might say, of Trump's behavior as a negotiator: provoke, make uncertain, and test your, quotes, adversary. Well, the Chinese announced on Monday, 9 o'clock, one-line announcement from the foreign ministry, Wang Yi's ministry, that the visit was on. And it appears then that they go on repeating last week's conditions. Now, what exactly the Chinese are doing is difficult to say. They also appear to have a policy of several no's. On the one hand, they wrap this up and call it the 4 propositions of President Xi. I'll just read them out, and I invite the audience to understand what meaning do these 4 propositions have. First, the principle of peaceful coexistence in the Middle East. Second, the principle of national sovereignty in the Middle East. Third, the principle of international rule of law. And fourth principle, I'm flipping the page so I can read it out, a balanced approach to development and security. Security is a prerequisite for development, and China is ready to share the opportunities of Chinese modernization with the Gulf countries and work with them to foster favorable conditions for development and security. Those are the 4 propositions. They either mean something or they mean absolutely nothing, because they are so vague, they are not applied to the current negotiation. They are the Chinese equivalent of what Putin is calling, Putin only, and his emissary to the United States, Kirill Dmitriev, the Anchorage formula. What is this? It's no criticism of Trump, no action to deter the Americans from doing what they're doing, no escalation control on the Chinese side, and no hurry on Xi's side. He wasn't in a hurry to, as it were, postpone the visit and put more pressure than the Chinese side had done last year when they did postpone the previous summit date on Trump. You ask, what do they hope to gain? Well, they say, and there's an interesting account by Kurt Campbell, who was responsible during the Biden administration for China policy. It's just appeared in Foreign Affairs, May 11, so that's yesterday, how the summit could change the course of US-China competition. If I took what Campbell has to say in answer to your question, he'd be saying, I don't know either. He calls, pardon me, the US position strategic ambiguity. He doesn't know how China will respond to these mixed signals from Trump. What he does emphasize, pardon me, is that Trump is escalating on Taiwan. It's preparing one of the largest arms deals with Taiwan that include upgraded, modernized drone and other warfare means drawn out of the experience of fighting Russia on the Ukraine battlefield. China replies, Taiwan's the core interest to be discussed with Trump. So Campbell, speaking with the experience of the Biden administration, doesn't know what Trump will do. He calls that strategic ambiguity. He's ambiguous, he doesn't know. Trump, he thinks, is ambiguous. He doesn't know what kind of deal Trump can make on the Taiwan issue. It's not the only one that China's made very clear. As another military priority, it's the remilitarization of Japan. This is the mirror image of Russia's concern at the remilitarization of Germany, of Poland, of Finland, as part of NATO's further expansion of military threat towards Russia as NATO continues to move east. China's been very clear that behavior of Japan, its increasing exercises with new US missile capabilities, which are dual capable, nuclear capable missile firings, are unacceptable evidence of a return by Japan to its warfare, to the Second World War. So, in brief answer to your question, how does the four propositions, so-called, of President Xi represent any form of negotiating framework with Trump, given what we've already described as Trump's incapability to understand a piece of paper with 14 points or 3 stages on it? Answer, Trump can't comprehend the four propositions, even if we could, and we can't. Can President Xi be counted on to be clear to Trump? Yes, he can. And according to the US versions I see, China will be very clear on Taiwan, on Japan, on the remilitarization of the entire region from Canada down to Australia, all aimed at China. Yes, China will be clear about that. Will it be so clear as Wang Yi tried to say to Abbas Araghchi last week in support of Iran's sovereignty, Iran's self-determination, Iran's security? Answer, unlikely. Unlikely it will be so clear. Does that mean, from an Iranian point of view, less Chinese support? more readiness of China to cut a separate deal with Trump? Does it mean China puts coexistence with the hegemon ahead of resolution on peaceful terms between Iran and the Arab states? All of that's unclear and uncertain. But the interesting part that I'd like to emphasize for our audience, that it's the Chinese position, the so-called four propositions, and the Russian position, Putin's position with the so-called Anchorage formula, are mirror images of the same problem. What's the problem? Well, it can't be spoken of, can it? If it's the first no, you can't criticize Trump. What is the problem for us? We are very clear about it. The United States threatens everyone. The Trump regime threatens everyone with violence, genocide, and destruction of state. First. Second, you can't negotiate in good faith with any of them.